3 weeks ago, the SNB, the Swiss National Bank, decided to drop the peg to the euro. This has raised many questions. One of them is the real value of the Swiss franc. So we have turned to Michel Girardin, who's professor of economics at the University of Geneva, and asked him how he would value the Swiss franc to the euro. Michel, good afternoon.
Nice to see you again, Nicolette. Well, there's really only one measure that we can think of when we want to assess whether a currency is under or overvalued, and that measure is purchasing power parity. Now, the concept behind it is very simple, is basically exchange rate need to reflect the purchasing power. When you go to a country, if it has higher inflation, but if you have a stronger currency when you go to that country, then you're equally well off, and so everything is fine. So as you can see from this chart, I did an illustration with the Swiss franc versus the euro. Let's assume, as we were in January 2000, we were at 160, and let us assume that we have an inflation rate of 11% in the eurozone and an inflation rate of 1% in Switzerland. Now, according to this theory, the Swiss franc would have to appreciate by the difference, i.e. 10%, within a year for the Swiss and the people from the Eurozone to have the same purchasing power in the same countries, in both countries. So if you go to France, after 1 year with an exchange rate of 144, i.e. 10% higher than initially, then you can pay for the goods which cost 10% more. If the year after the inflation rate in the Eurozone drops to 2% and 1% in Switzerland, so we have 1% differential. So the PPP, the purchasing power parity level of the Swiss franc versus euro would be 1% lower, i.e. 142.56. So that's the whole idea of and how this is how you measure the true theoretical value of the real exchange rate. It's the purchasing power.
But doesn't this not depend of where you start from? Because if you start, say, at 120, you would not have the same result.
That's precisely the point, Nicolette. This is the key to this metric is the anchoring point. Where do you anchor this PPP line, which moves once it's anchored only with the inflation differential? If there's none, the slope would be flat. If there is a higher inflation in the Eurozone, it would be trending down. So that's the whole point. And the problem is that if we start the chart in January 2000, then we have a 160. But if we take another period, then we would have, and so we would end with a very different result. So the anchoring point is crucial in this measure. So this is why there are different estimations of what the true value of the Swiss franc would be according to this theory.
But you have your own method to determine the anchoring point. That's right. What we really want to know.
Right. That's right. Actually, I did that when I was doing my PhD. I did my PhD on precisely the subject of how to measure PPP and try to explain the deviations from PPP. The solution is to not just choose a starting period a priori, but it is to make a regression between the nominal exchange rate and the inflation differentials. And basically, with this regression, it's a particular regression. You constrain the elasticity of the nominal exchange rate versus inflation differentials to 1, so you do a constrained regression, and by that you estimate the anchoring point. As it happens here, as you can see from this chart, it happens, but this is not necessarily true of all the currencies, that the anchoring point estimated here through the regression happens to be the same as the initial observation of 160 in January 2000. But again, this is here a coincidence. I have other charts measuring, for instance, the Swiss franc versus the dollar, where the blue line would not start at the same level as the red line as the anchor. So, and the whole thing about this is once we've done this, we sort of have removed the a prioriness of the anchoring point through this regression technique, and this comes, we have here the estimate of via this blue line.
Now, what is interesting in this graphic is that the overvaluation of the Swiss franc at the time when the peg was fixed and at the time when it was removed is actually the same, or nearly the same.
Yes.
Which means that what the SNB said in having a less overvalued Swiss franc in January this year is not the conclusion to which you reach.
Exactly. That's exactly the point, Nicolette. You can see here when we implemented the floor in September 2011, during this period of where we had the floor, the blue line stays flat. Here it's estimated not via consumer prices indices, but producer price indices, which are more accurate when you want to estimate the purchasing power. And you can see that the line is flat, meaning that there's no inflation differentials between Switzerland and the Eurozone. So it means that even if we have a different anchoring point, notwithstanding this regression techniques I just explained, and we have another anchoring point, we would have a different end estimation of what the PPP level would be, but it would be a parallel to this blue line. So we would have the same conclusion that because the slope of this blue line again is based on the inflation differential, so that doesn't change. So what the SNB said when it removed the floor, that the Swiss franc was less overvalued just before they moved the floor than it was when they implemented the floor, is not correct. The overvaluation of the Swiss franc has not moved by 1 iota.
And how much, what is the real value of the Swiss franc according to you?
According to this estimate here, which again is the only estimate we can think of when we want to assess whether currencies are over or undervalued. Basically, this is a variation on the theme of the Big Mac parity, which is more popular. Here, the only difference is that we take a bigger basket than just the Big Mac. So here, my estimation is 131 for the Swiss franc versus the euro.
Which happens to be apparently very close to the figure that the SNB has given to the IMF last summer.
Right, you have more information than I do, because apparently the SNB...
Just hearsay.
Because the SNB, as I know, does not publish any estimations of what the PPP is. They have obviously their idea, but maybe they were asked by the IMF to provide that figure. But
Possibly.
Right.
Now, the SNB has still claimed that the Swiss franc has weakened over this period.
In real terms.
In real terms.
Exactly.
And over all currencies, over the basket.
Yes.
So,
yes, this is what we see in this chart. Here I put the Swiss franc versus the euro, that's the red line. Swiss franc versus the dollar, that's the blue line. And the Swiss franc in real effective terms, i.e. a basket of all the trading partners of Switzerland and deflated by the inflation differentials. So this is the best measure we can think of to assess Switzerland's competitiveness for its exports. So what we see here is that indeed we have had a trend when these lines move above, trend upwards, it's a weaker Swiss franc, and conversely. And you see this area where I circled that green dotted line. Basically we have this trend towards a weaker Swiss franc, but that's just a reflection of the dollar, of the rising dollar, of the weakening Swiss franc versus the dollar. It's not a reflection of what happens to the euro. The euro stays at 120 versus the Swiss franc. So that gain of competitiveness comes from the dollar. It does not come from the euro. So arguing that you can remove the floor of the euro by saying that we've gained competitiveness vis-a-vis the dollar is a bit of a...
well, it's not entirely wrong, because if you think about it, although clearly the exchanges with the Eurozone are quite strong, Switzerland doesn't only export to the Eurozone by far.
That's correct. But indeed, what we would have then, the argument would hold true if we would say have a different policy than anchoring or semi-anchoring the Swiss franc to a single currency, which would be the euro. The alternative to that would be to do to link the Swiss franc to a basket of currencies, of which the euro is one component, but we have all the dollars, the yen, and so forth. So basically, it would amount to setting a target or a floor even to the real effective exchange rate.
Exactly.
In that case, yes, it would have been probably, we can maybe make a case here of saying if we had that target, this recent movement in the dollar has alleviated somewhat the overvaluation of the Swiss franc. But indeed, it remains, as we see here from this chart, it remains pretty high. Indeed, the Swiss franc remains the most overvalued currency of the world.
Which is clearly not very good for exports.
Indeed, and this chart brings this point home. Basically, we have here, again, the Swiss franc in real effective exchange terms. Here we have year-on-year changes, and when that red line is trending down, it's a weaker Swiss franc. And we can see that when we have that, we have rising Swiss exports, which are depicted here in blue and on a reverted scale. So a drop in the blue line is actually a rise in exports, and conversely. So
just to confuse everybody.
Just, yes, a bit of an academic chart.
Bit
really.
of counterintuitive.
Indeed. Right, but the message is what counts, as basically when we have a weaker Swiss franc, then we can expect, as we had here in 2012, we had a weaker Swiss franc and then we had a boost in exports. So today, clearly, given the fact that the Eurozone accounts for a lot of is a major trading partner of Switzerland, clearly the removal of the floor will not help in here.
Michel, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Nicolette. Thank you.